dollars you spend in the development stage are the most at-risk dollars because there's no guarantee that that project is going to come to fruition. And if it does, there's no guarantee it's going to look like what you thought it was going to look like. Energy projects are so complex. The project that you start with might not be the project that you end with. As we talked about, we often rely on what we've done in the past.
Welcome to our first episode in a series focused on infrastructure. I'm Francis, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of Floative AI. We started this company to help build and maintain infrastructure. We currently have a supply problem. Everything from housing to electricity seems to be getting more expensive. We can't seem to build enough in places with the most demand. To figure out why, I sat down with Ellen Crivella. Ellen has over 20 years of experience working in large infrastructure development. She has worked on over 30 gigawatts of power that has been financed or developed. She started her career doing fieldwork for engineering and construction compliance. She's been a global head of permitting as well as a VP of development. So her experience really spans the breadth of all things development. Here's what she has to say. So Ellen, what do you do? What are some things you would like the world to know about your impressive achievements?
Yeah, thanks. I am a large project infrastructure development expert. I've been doing this now for about 20 years, and I started my career doing work on linear energy facilities, things like pipelines and transmission lines, and have worked in renewable energy project development for quite some time now. So, wind, onshore and offshore, solar, battery energy storage. I've even advised a little bit most recently on some data center siting projects. I really was fortunate in that I started my career doing a lot of field work, both on the development side and for construction compliance. So it really gave me a great foundation to understand how to develop projects in an appropriate way, thinking about the end result of, the compliance, the operational requirements early on leads to generally a good way to go about developing projects. So I've worked as an independent engineer for banks. I've been the global head of permitting. I've been a VP of development. So really, all roads in my career have led to project siting, project development, and project compliance activities.
You've worked across consulting, development, and execution on some of the first large-scale offshore wind projects in the US. What's something that would surprise people outside the industry? And what do industry insiders consistently underestimate about getting projects from concept to being operational?
Yeah, wow. There's so many things that I think would surprise people. Just generally, energy projects are so complex. There's so many things to consider. Everything from the wildlife to the impacts to the substrate, to how are you going to fund and in some cases build or retrofit vessels to install projects. And that was true in the early days for onshore construction activities as well. But certainly for offshore, there's a whole world of vessel considerations and things that need to be built and fit for purpose that don't already exist. So you're thinking about those things from the very earliest stages of project development because you're trying to consider what does the financial pro forma look like? What is the right deployment of capital over what time? The dollars you spend in the development stage are the most at-risk dollars because there's no guarantee that that project is going to come to fruition. And if it does, there's no guarantee it's going to look like what you thought it was going to look like when you first started out developing the project.
When you think of project success, you think of finance, engineering, and construction. But in reality, it's a lot more complicated. There's permitting, interconnections, supply chain, and communities. So you start off with the financing of the project. You look at what the financials of the project would look like. You look
Yes.
at permitting, you look at technical constraints, and then you're also looking at operational constraints, and all of those complexities really add up because the dollars are at risk earlier on in the process, and you're trying to get as much visibility end to end as you possibly can.
That's right. Yep, that's absolutely right. And I think, throughout that process, you asked what was one thing that those of us in the industry underestimate. And I think throughout that process, something that we're always optimistic about is the timeline. We always think we're gonna be able to get it done faster. or more smoothly. Even the most realistic project developers, I think, have to have a little bit of an optimistic slant to them. So, it's everything from getting a lease if you're on public lands to signing up lands with individual landowners if you're on private lands. Getting full coverage on your studies. Sometimes you don't have all of your land signed up, but you need to get out there and start understanding the area, start understanding the wildlife, the people. And so sometimes those things are running in parallel tracks. And that, of course, you do to be a bit efficient, but also in the long run, sometimes can cause it to take a bit longer. And then there's the negotiation of the supply agreements. Those always take longer than we want, whether it's, where are your inverters coming from? Can you get them on time? What does that turbine supply agreement look like? Who's going to do the maintenance and how does that fit into the overall agreement? These are all things that we figure out before we take financial investment decisions on the projects. And so, there's just a lot to think about. And, we use these tools to manage our risk and provide us with clarity and certainty. Sometimes they're just spreadsheets, other times they're more robust tools, but having a way to look back on previous projects or on projects that are similar in the development pipeline, or just simply having clarification of what we think the sticking points might be. Those are generally the things we sort of look to anchor ourselves and hopefully have some more realistic approaches to schedule. When you're dealing with anything commercial, predictability is your friend and certainty is your friend. So, really understanding what's worked in the past can sometimes be the magic that leads you to then have a little space for some creative thinking on how we can do it better or faster.
Yeah, absolutely. So lots of looking at past projects, what has worked previously, using a lot of different tools and finding the right tools to do a lot of these prediction steps before a steel even hits the ground. But taking a step back, I want to talk about the end-to-end process, including the actual construction of it. Where do you see projects breaking down most commonly?
Oh boy. I mean, it can vary by jurisdiction, which is a reason why taking a nuanced approach is generally key to project success. As you noted, it's not always the same thing that causes stress on a project. Sometimes it's community acceptance. Sometimes you find a protected species present that you didn't expect to be there, and then you have to pivot. And you have to then maybe do some additional studies or maybe have some additional conversations to make sure that the right mitigation measures are in place or the right level of avoidance happens. One example, a little bit of a different example, is in the early days of wind development in places like Texas and Washington. We found that there were certain geological formations underground or soil conditions that made the installation of the foundations as they were designed to be really challenging. And so, you might, in those instances, you're all the way through your permitting process, you're out in the field, and you realize, oh my goodness, I need a dynamic compactor to, make this really fine soil be fit for purpose, or oh my gosh, there's these karst formations, and if we put a foundation here, it'll actually sink much more than we expected it to. And so redesigning a foundation at that late stage is something that no engineering team wants to do. No project development team wants to have that conversation. So it can be, there's a lot of points throughout the process where you can bump into challenges. And so in those instances, we took that knowledge, of course, and we shared it internally, but also sometimes that sort of thing gets shared externally as well at conferences and industry meetings and things like that, so that others in the industry don't make the same mistakes.
So sounds like there's a huge reactive component to project development as well as you discover new information, and that can dramatically change the scope and even the type of project that you're building. What is separating the teams that can navigate all this complexity and deliver a successful project? What sets them aside from the ones that stall out?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think having alignment early on in the strategy and the roadmap for the project is really important. You kind of have to have a sense of what is the minimum viable product? What does that look like when you're talking about a project? Does it need to be a certain size? Does it need to be a certain technology? Because you have technology that you've already signed agreements for that you're looking to deploy. Is it that you have found an opportunity to advance a project through the interconnection queue and you really want to focus your efforts there? So I think having a broader regional strategy that you all can be aligned on and then a really strong roadmap for the project is probably the best way to navigate complexity, but you can't be so rigid that, you can't pivot when new information comes to light. So, sometimes that's new information where your modeled assumptions change based on the measured data, or you collect new information from stakeholders or conversations with the regulators. I mean, that happens all the time too. I think high performing teams take in that information, they share it with each other, they adjust their pathway forward, they ask, how does this fit into the regional strategy? And then they move forward. So I think this like nuanced approach of navigating complexity too, it affects everything from then how you price your electrons in your power purchase agreement to, the terms you're willing to accept when you're working with vendors. It's all very interrelated.
So it sounds like a lot of cancellations can happen before permitting, and there are cancellations that can happen after permitting as well. And a lot of post-permitting cancellations might be tied to these undiscovered variables, such as the soil types, the bedrock, things of that nature that cause re-engineering and tie directly into costs. Can you tell me a little bit more about cancellations end to end?
Yeah, well, we have a phrase in the industry where we like to say every project dies a thousand deaths. And it's just an indication that the project that you start with might not be the project that you end with. Oftentimes, there's a lot of conflict in the pipeline as well, in terms of, there's only so much capital that can be deployed. And so you are often pitching your project idea against some other projects in the portfolio and really making the case as to why you should have funds allocated to sign those turbine supply agreements or spend a substantial number of dollars with an EPC contractor. So projects start, they get shelved, they get rethought, they come back. It's common for a project to start out and be very large and then maybe get pared down or turned into a project where you approach it from a phased approach, where you say, we'll install 100 megawatts now and 100 megawatts in phase two. I've even seen projects shift from starting out as wind projects, and then you discover there are a large number of bats that would have a big, the project could potentially have an impact on those species. And then we shift and we say, well, the solar resource is good enough. Let's make this a solar project. Yeah, it's not that every project gets canceled or has a high potential for being canceled, but I would say every project does have quite a high potential for looking differently at the end than what you started out with at the beginning.
Can you give me some more specifics on some of these, the species, discharge considerations, archaeological considerations? That's something that keeps coming up, construction compliance and monitoring, so on and so forth.
Yes, I mean, there are so many moving pieces, right? And one piece that always seems to be changing is that regulations evolve. New species are listed as we learn things about them, and sometimes species recover and are delisted. We learn things when there's litigation. Sometimes that happens. Technologies advance. There's new best available science all the time for species deterrent or using things like LIDAR to track vegetation management or drones to be cleaning blades and panels. I mean, the technological advancements are great, but as we talked about, we often rely on what we've done in the past. And when you have new, better technology, it's good. It makes for an evolved situation, but it's a thing that then does not allow you to just do what was done previously and know that that will be an acceptable standard. All sorts of ways of thinking about this. And I mean, even just even in just where we site projects. I mean, 30 years ago, we would site wind projects in particular in places that had impacts on birds and bats. We didn't understand until the projects were in the ground. And, now we have a really good sense of what migratory pathways look like, what species are good at avoidance, what mitigation measures work. So, I think that's a win for species, for example, and it's a win for projects. We certainly don't want to put them in places where there's a large impact, right?
Yeah.
We're also much better at stakeholder outreach. We're better at data sharing than we were years ago. Often, especially federal agencies, but often agencies that we work with in general will want to have data sharing agreements or will ask us to track certain things and then share that information with them. In the instance of offshore wind development, for instance, we used to share a lot of Met Ocean information with Coast Guard, not because we had to, but simply because having the degree of monitoring stations that we had in the ocean was very helpful for maritime safety and navigation purposes. So there can be some additional benefits there, but these are all things that we need to be tracking as well to make sure that the projects are being constructed and operated in an appropriate way.
That's amazing. So you're also thinking of other ways that your activities could help other agencies, other people. So layering use cases on top of use cases using technology that you might already be using for permitting. Yeah. I think that reactivity versus proactivity seems to play a huge role in all of these development projects. Have you seen cases where something small that was reactive caused a major setback?
Yeah, I mean, I think something that maybe seems small, and this is getting back to the reputation and the brand of the organization. Something that can seem small, like a non-compliance situation, that can end up having a huge cost to the organization in that you do erode that trust. In some instances, when you have small non-compliance issues, you are given a warning or a notice of non-compliance. You're usually given a chance to fix it and remedy the situation before you receive any sort of fine or notice of violation. But projects are big and complicated. Certainly, large scale, gigawatt scale, or multi-hundred megawatt scale renewable energy projects. There's layers and layers of suppliers and consultants, people working on the job that maybe are a sub-consultant to a prime consultant. And so sometimes there's a breakdown in communication. And one area where I've seen this time and time again has been in stormwater and sediment, erosion and sediment control violations. I think it was just a couple years ago in 2004, DOJ and EPA reached a over $2 million settlement for some stormwater violations across a couple of projects. I think they were solar projects in 3 different states. And similarly, in 2002, there were a number of solar farms, all managed by the same civil contractor that had done things in an inappropriate way. And that developer settled for about $1.3 million from their violations. And, solar projects, 1 or 2 million dollars, that has a huge impact to the bottom line of a solar project. So, starting out small little violations that eventually become big violations that eventually become civil settlements, those can really hurt your project financials. So when that happens, you try to learn from the mistakes of whether it's an internal mistake you've made or whether you're reading about it in the paper, like these stormwater violations. You have to ask yourself, what was it that caused the missteps? Did we not train our contractors appropriately? Was it a lack of communication? Did they not have access to the permit conditions or the guidebooks? Did the accountable party not put in place the right level of checks or controls? So, small breakdowns can compound over time, and violations like that really hurt the viability of projects. And then in the long run, it leads to increased regulation, or maybe tangible effects like rate increases because you need to renegotiate your PPA because the price that you had initially thought you could sell the power at has increased because you're paying a lot of dollars in civil fines. So
Mhm.
things often start out small, and if you don't have a good mechanism for managing the risk, they can really balloon.
What does the day-to-day operational reality for getting all these approvals actually look like for most teams today?
Yeah, the permitting process can really vary based on jurisdiction and the level of information required for review. So, for instance, if you have a federal nexus anticipated on the project, like you're going to impact enough wetlands or waters where you need an individual permit, or you expect that there'll be some impact to protected species and you need to get a take permit, then that review could be under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, as many people have heard. In a NEPA review, it often takes multiple months, if not years, to collect data to support the environmental assessment process. There's stakeholder consultation, there's scoping meetings, there's lots of opportunity for public involvement and engagement, and many documents produced. So that can be quite a complex process. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you might have local township or county level permitting. And these are cases where, there's not those really broad federal level type impacts, but instead it's much more of working day to day with the community, negotiating things like road use agreements or tax abatement agreements or other community benefit agreements, as well as determining the best way to site the infrastructure so that neighbors are comfortable with the project. Maybe it needs to be set back from a certain location for a visual purpose, for instance. And then in some states like Oregon, California, Illinois, New York, there's others. There's also sometimes state level regulatory requirements, and those generally tend to be somewhere in between the NEPA process and the local county level process in terms of level of requirement.
Mhm.
So all of the processes are different in every location, even state siting permitting processes, they're different between each state. And so there's always a period of time where you are ramping up, you're trying to figure out the plan for the project's permit approvals. You might plan a permit matrix to help you scope the efforts correctly. You're trying to understand what level of study effort is required. And sometimes that's where inefficiencies can be noticeable. If you're planning to do 1 year of data collection to capture seasonality, but in reality, the permitting authority wants 2 years or more data, then your project's timeline can slip by that amount of time.
And how do teams scale across all of these jurisdictions when every state, every county, multiple agencies and utilities can have very different set of expectations and processes?
Yeah, it's a really great question. We often rely on experienced consultants, folks who have worked in a particular jurisdiction that are especially familiar with the project type of technology, or one who's just very familiar with the laws in that jurisdiction. That helps us scale. Having access to information, whether it be through a trusted advisor who can work with you to guide you on the project, or if it's just simply consolidated information right at your fingertips. That's really helpful in understanding what does the scope look like, how much time and effort is going to be devoted to it. And that's, of course, important when you are, planning your project development activities and considering project A that's located in one jurisdiction with a particular set of requirements and parameters versus project B.
And at the risk of oversimplifying here, it seems like a common theme that keeps reoccurring during this conversation is here's what's been done in the past and tribal knowledge. So you're relying on the expertise of people that have succeeded in specific regions in the past and bringing them into the fold, and that's how you're able to move forward. And then when regulations change or things change, there is going to be a lot of manual effort involved in trying to understand how you need to adapt to these changes today.
Yeah, I mean that's absolutely right. And I think the savvy developers are the ones who are able to harness that and do that quickly. Get from that place of reactivity to proactivity as fast as possible. I mean, that saves you time. And as we all know, time is money, right?
So, last question. There is a lot of discussion right now around speeding up infrastructure and energy development in the US. But in your view, what actually needs to change so projects can move faster without actually increasing risk?
Oh, wow. This is a great question. And there's a lot being done about permitting reform out there. I think we are starting to really understand the impacts of large energy infrastructure development. And I think to some degree, we should follow the model that we've seen for oil and gas infrastructure in the past, where projects are able to move forward with either categorical exemptions or really routine mitigation measures so that as long as your project fits within a certain risk profile, you have a really standardized approach to moving forward. And we're actually starting to see that in the realm of energy development, with the wetland permitting, as long as you impact below a certain threshold of permanent wetland impact. There's a routine set of mitigations that you can follow. Generally, they're different between each Army Corps of Engineers region to get a little bit in the weeds, but they're not all that different. And so, as long as you can stay below a certain threshold and commit to certain mitigation members, you're able to move forward without needing to go through a really lengthy review process. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has worked really hard in recent years too on revising the eagle take permit rules so that you can get either a 5-year permit if you think that the impacts are going to be minimal. There's more of a self-service type permit like that general wetland permit I was talking about. And then, of course, there's the 30-year permit for if you do anticipate that there will be some broader impacts, then you do go through a more robust process. So I think taking the learnings of the last 30 or 40 years of project infrastructure development, making things a little bit more standardized, understanding where are the trade-offs that we're willing to make to, move forward with clean energy development, understanding that there will be some level of impact. But the threshold is not no impact, that it is, you avoid the impact where you can, and then you minimize or mitigate the impact over time. I think we'll eventually start moving towards that. But again, getting to some of our conversation points previously, that will be all under that umbrella of evolving regulations. And so, for better or for worse, we will then need to track and understand that and really understand the bounds under which we can work to be successful.
My biggest takeaway from my conversation with Ellen is that infrastructure development starts off as an information problem. Long before permits are filed or construction begins, developers are making decisions based off of incomplete data. And the teams that succeed are the ones that use data to identify risks early, align stakeholders, and adapt quickly as new information emerges. In our next episode, we'll dive into another constraint that is becoming increasingly important for both power generation and data centers. As AI drives unprecedented demand for compute infrastructure and access to power, the ability to source, manage, and permit water may be ultimately what determines where these projects can be built. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.